Conservative. Constitutional. It's the Andrew Cooperrider Show, keeping you informed on what's going on right here in Kentucky.
And welcome everybody to another amazing day right here on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. Of course, I'm your host, Andrew Cooperrider, and boy, do we've got a full and very exciting show for you today. A lot of things to cover. As I expected, I got a lot of comments back regarding my take on cursive and how mandating it and not just letting cursive die is silly, and we should do that. And that passing a law and making it a required part of K through 12 education is keeping alive something that is outdated. And naturally, a lot of people took issue with that. So I'll be responding to your comments on that. And by take issue, of course, we all know this is just a in jest, good-hearted, good-natured debate of sorts about, what's important and what's not for our government to be doing. So we'll be covering that at the end of today's show. But first, I want to start off by talking about partisan elections. Something I believe in. I believe as many elections as possible should be partisan. I'm talking about, whether it's your city council races, your school board races, even your judge races, I believe should be partisan. And here's why. Because I believe in an informed as possible electorate when they are voting. Here's just the facts of the matter. Most people who vote aren't very informed on who they're voting on, especially on the down ticket items when it comes to things like your magistrates, your city councils, your school boards, especially judges. Judges is one that is just, there is no way for anybody to be very well informed on. And it's not just because you can study the races even and have a hard time being informed on who to vote for a judge's race. For an example, right now in this kind of central region here, we have our state Supreme Court election coming up here in November between two candidates. The question is, which one is the best one to pick, which one to choose from? And the reason why it's so hard to compare them is, first, you can't really ask them very many questions. You can ask them what their values are, but you can't ask these judges, how would you rule on a case? When somebody's running for office as a judge, they're not allowed, by some rule, to answer the question, let's say you were looking at the abortion law case that came before the Supreme Court recently. How would you rule on that? They're not allowed to say how they would rule on that. In fact, as the law sits right now, well, not law, I think it's actually the Kentucky Bar Association, which has this rule. The way it sits now, judges can't even, it gets a little legally tense on if judges can say, people running for judges' offices can say what party they're a member of. This is a rather recent thing. There's been some court challenges. Some of you may remember up in the northern Kentucky area, state Supreme Court race dealing with he was former state House Rep Joe Fisher. Joe Fisher, that was his name, Joe Fisher. And so you may remember that race there. And there was actually a court case that took place during that election because Joe was identifying himself in his opponent's minds, or whoever took him to court's minds, that he was identifying himself as a Republican too much so. And so that becomes a big issue. So they can't talk about how they would rule on cases. They can't talk about very openly what their party affiliation is. And then when it comes down to, okay, do you want to reelect a judge or not? It's very difficult for the common citizen to look at whether or not they're a good judge. I'll give you a perfect example. Do you know what the average judge in your area, how they stack up about their bail? So, if you're electing a criminal law judge, maybe you want to know how often do they grant bail? How often do they release criminals? How often are they releasing, car thieves back onto the streets with no bail? How often is that happening? Do you know how to find that out? Do you know where to find that statistic at? Because it really doesn't exist. It's not easy to get a hold of it all. You would have to do a lot of work. In fact, some longtime listeners may remember I talked about a story, this was a few months ago, regarding a Lexington judge who dismissed a murder charge against somebody, not because they were innocent or there was some other issue, but part of the reason why this judge, she dismissed this murder charge was because she said that the Lexington, the Commonwealth attorney in that area, who, by the way, black woman, important to this, was acting in a racist manner in the amount that they were charging him, that they were only charging him at the charges they were because he was black and because the Lexington area Commonwealth attorney was racist, even though she is a black female. And so she dismissed murder charges. Do you, by chance, remember that judge's name? It was Julie Goodman, by the way. That's who that judge was. But no, you didn't. You didn't remember it. And so come election time and you're staring at a ballot and you're looking at judges' names, and if you live in Lexington or whatever area you live in and you look at those judges' races, how do you know who to vote for? Who's told you who to vote for? You're relying on what, lawyers to tell you who's a good judge and who's a bad judge? That shouldn't be how we're doing our elections. We should have an informed electorate as possible. Now, granted, when you go over to city councils or you go over to, school board races, it's a little bit easier to look at a voting history. You can look at ordinances that were passed if it's city council, or you can look at policies and spending that was approved if it's school board and look who voted yes and no, because they actually have meetings with a voting record that you can look at if you so choose to. But we know the average voter isn't going to go ahead and do that. And in the absence of some sort of test to make sure a person knows who they're voting for before they're allowed to cast a ballot, which will never happen. We know that's not going to happen here in Kentucky. The best thing we have available to us is their party affiliation. When you throw an R next to your name, you throw a D next to your name. What you're saying is I'm identifying with the values of that party. If I'm a Democrat and I'm throwing a D next to my name and I'm running for judge, well, maybe they're not going to be super tough on crime. Maybe they're not going to be, if they will have cases about abortion before them, you might have some indication of what their belief is on abortion. Because remember, when you look at a party's platform, it tells you what their belief is on constitutional items. You go through the Republican Party platform, you go through the Democrat Party platform, it has interpretations of the Constitution and what they believe on those items within the documents themselves. And so when a person says, I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican, you can see how they are actually, what their thought process is behind it. And this whole entire nonpartisan and unable to say anything is exactly how we're getting things like the Soros prosecutors and the Soros judges in other cities, maybe not in your area, but we just end up with bad judges, bad prosecutors that are leading to this higher rate of crime in our communities. That's just on the judges' races. And like I said, city council races, yes, I would love for every voter to sit there and actually research who they're going to vote for, but they're not going to do it. So at least by putting an R or D next to their name, you can get some sense of what that person who you're voting for, what their actual beliefs are, or at least some idea of what their thought processes are. So I believe in partisan elections, but there's something that the legislature here in Kentucky is doing right now. Yesterday, they did this yesterday, that is undermining this very principle, because while they're pushing forward some partisan elections in one way, they're undermining it in another way. And we'll be talking about that, as well as this just flaw that's going on in our legislature of changing the laws of elections just simply based upon you don't like the outcomes of it and why that's bad for us. We'll be digging into that after this short break. You're listening to The Andrew Cooperrider Show. Of course, I'm your host, Andrew Cooperrider. Want to reach out to the show? Feel free to email info@theandrewshow.com. And you are back with The Andrew Cooperrider Show, your source for Kentucky politics. Of course, I'm your host, Andrew Cooperrider. Before the break, we were discussing about partisan elections and how I do believe personally, and I laid out my arguments, that having as much of a partisan elections as possible is a good thing. Partisan judge elections, partisan school board, partisan city council. However, our legislature is taking some steps in the right direction, but at the same time, they're undermining their own argument. And that is how we had this weird thing occur yesterday, where you had Senate Bill 8 heard in committee at the same time House Bill 388 was also heard in committee. So Senate Bill 8 being heard in the committee would make school boards partisan elections. Clearly a very good thing, in my opinion. Once again, I laid out my arguments, but also you do have a fair amount of school boards in very conservative areas that somehow end up with these very liberal representatives on the school board, because you just, frankly, you end up with a lot of quote unquote Democrats and liberals finding their way onto that board there and not representing the values of the community. But of course, our electorate isn't informed enough to know that. But by having at least an RD next to their name, it gives them a little bit more information about who they're voting for in the ballot box. But that's a good thing, right? People being more informed on who they're voting for, maybe having some clue of what their values are. However, at the same time that Senate Bill 8 is being heard in committee yesterday, House Bill 388, which would make Louisville City Council elections specifically nonpartisan, is being heard. Now, of course, the reason why they're looking at House Bill 388 to make Louisville City Council elections nonpartisan is because Louisville is a liberal city. And right now, their city council is partisan. It doesn't mean there's no Republicans who win. Some Republicans do win, of course, but it's majority Democrat because, and the belief is that, well, if they were nonpartisan elections, maybe we could get a few more Republicans on board and Louisville City Council would be better off. But this points to a very big problem we have going on in our legislature right now in a thought process. And they are pushing forward bills and constitutional amendments not based upon principles, but based upon simply they want to win elections. And I understand it's very hard to take the high road on this because you have Democrats out here passing all kinds of laws to help them win elections. Because let's just call a spade a spade. The more dumb people who vote, the more Democrats will win, because dumb people let their votes be bought with things like spending plans and other types of things. I said it. Okay, I'll say it. That the more people who vote, if you have higher election turnouts in general and you have more people voting, Democrats do win a little bit more often because if you're turning out people who don't normally vote to vote, they're uninformed. And uninformed people more often will vote for Democrats. They just do. It's because their votes are bought. They're like, yeah, I like my money that I'm getting for free. I want my free this and free that. Oh, that talking point sounds nice. I don't need to think critically. I will vote for this person because that's just how they think. Now, of course, that is working against them to a degree right now in the national politics because you are seeing those same kind of masses that the Democrats normally turn out to vote for them, saying, whoa. The Joe Biden's done such a bad job and it's so obvious that maybe I don't want to vote for him. Though if you were informed as an electorate on who you're voting for, you would have realized that, you know, the Joe Biden, the Democrat policies, generally speaking, are bad. They hold us back. You can't keep shelling out money and giving it to people without having to pay the piper for it. You can't do it. But of course, the more people you vote, the more votes can be bought. I mean, we did see this in 2020. I mean, you had Joe Biden walk around saying, I'll get you like, what was it, like $3,000? I'll get you $3,000 and Trump won't. I mean, literally, a campaign promise was to write you a $3,000 check. So, of course, more of the quote-unquote dumb masses, uninformed voters, and I know I'm using some kind of crass words here to describe them, but I'm just being honest that this is what we're ending up with here, that they are bought off by that concept. They just are. And so Democrats will change the rules and laws in order to try to get as many people to vote as possible because it's good for them. They want more college students to vote. They want illegal immigrants to vote. They want lax ID laws because they want it to be easy for people to vote. They want mail-in balloting because they want to be able to mass mail out ballots so then they can put in place their ballot harvesting programs. We see the Democrats doing that. And so I understand why it's very hard for Republicans to not directly pass laws to benefit them. Now, if you want to pass, my belief in saying, hey, we should vote on one day and it should be a little more difficult to vote is not because I'm mad at election outcomes as much as party, but I'm mad that so many uninformed people vote, and I don't want to encourage more uninformed people to vote. That isn't a good thing. I don't think high turnouts in elections is something that, as a society, we should view as a good thing, because, I mean, if this turnout coming up in November will be around 60%. Probably 60-ish% because it's a presidential election, maybe even 65-ish%. Very high turnout compared to this last election for governor, which I believe was in the 30s-ish, right? And I got to ask you, do you really think a high percentage of that 60%, they may understand the presidential elections going on, they may even understand the congressional elections going on, but what do you think the chances are when you look around your area there, your county, your city, and you look at who you're talking to on the street that's above the age of 18 that is eligible to vote, do you think really 60% of them know who makes a good city council member? Do you think 60% of them know who makes a good mayor? Do you think 60% of them are informed enough to vote on things like school board to understand who they're voting for, or judge races? I don't think so. I personally don't. You can disagree with me, but I personally don't. And so that is my principle. It's got nothing to do with party and everything to do with the level of informed voters. But for these Republicans and what they're passing out of our legislature, it seems the only principle here is winning elections. They don't like the outcomes of the Louisville city council election, so let's just completely change the rules about how somebody's selected. Oh, I don't like the outcomes of school board races. Well, let's just change the rules. Oh, I don't like the outcome of the last governor's election. Let's change the Constitution in order to move all these elections onto the presidential election year, making that ballot now extremely long, because not only do you have those, but now you're going to have You can have up to 4 constitutional amendments on the ballot. And by the way, David Osborne just proposed one, so that one will definitely make it on. I mean, I think we're going to be looking at 3. I think we're going to be looking at least 3 amendments on our ballot coming up right now based on what's filed and what's moving. And that's not even including this one that would that has passed out of the Senate over to the House that would move those governor elections and those other elections and constitutional officer elections like attorney general, ag commissioner, so on and so forth, to the same year as the presidential election year. So you throw that on with constitutional amendments, you're talking about pages of ballots here, and they're talking about voter fatigue being a reason to move it. You want to talk about voter fatigue? Talk about having one long, huge ballot like this. It's out of control. But, you know, that idea, that amendment there, I don't think will necessarily pass the House, the amendment to move the governor's elections, because once again, if their principle is about winning elections and it's got nothing to do with actual principles about turnout or about, you know, some sort of election belief, you just saying, I want people to win that I want to win, and I will change the law to make it happen. And I like I said, I'm just against that in principle. It's ugly. It's gross to look at. But if that's your principle, well, nobody in the House is going to vote yes on this amendment because they run for election every 2 years. Right now, those off-year elections, governor, treasurer, auditor, secretary of state, all those elections is the only election where state House reps don't have to give up their seat to run for, because you can't run for 2 offices at the same time. So if you move all those races onto the every 4 years, this off-year here, if you move those off-year elections onto the presidential election year, well, now the state House reps will have to decide between running for one of those seats or giving up their seat. I don't think they want to do that, and that's playing at the back of their mind, and I think that's why it's always failed in the past, too, to pass the House. But going back to my overall point, though, here, about changing the rules because you don't like the outcome, or just changing how we do elections, turning it on its head because you don't like the outcome. How about you put forward better candidates? How about you do the hard work of convincing people to turn out and vote for your person? See, that's the other reason why I don't like changing the rules, because I want Republicans to put forward a better candidates. I want Republicans to have to do the hard work, our Republican representatives, of actually going out, talking to their base, and figuring out how to get people to turn out. I don't want them to win by happen chance. I want them to win because they're listening to us, because that's how we get better and more conservative people in office. Because right now we are struggling with some of these people to get them to do conservative things. And the reason why we're struggling is because they're not worried about losing their elections. And so by moving around these elections more and saying, hey, you don't got to worry about listening to people. You don't got to worry about being inspiring. You don't got to worry about turning people out. That's not of your concern anymore because they're just going to turn out anyways. By doing that, you're giving us cruddier representatives. So that's another reason why I care a lot about that, is because I want good people being elected to represent us in Kentucky. I do. You can disagree, and that's okay. You can have different thoughts. Email me at info@theandrewshow.com if you disagree. But Osborne, as I said, he did propose an amendment, which makes me think it will. We'll see more than a few amendments on this next ballot. We'll be going over what he proposed after this short break. You're listening to the Andrew Cooperrider Show, your source for Kentucky politics. And you are back with the Andrew Cooperrider Show, your source for Kentucky politics. So before the break, I'd mentioned that House Speaker, Kentucky House Speaker, not federal speaker. Come on now, we focus on Kentucky politics on this show. So we ain't talking about the federal House, but the state House Speaker, Osborne, has filed an amendment similar to Matt Lockett's amendment that we spoke about a few weeks ago that would get rid of the end date, the sine die day, the end day of session. But his would go a little step further and add another 12 days after that the legislature could call itself into session. Okay. So that would mean that on these off year years, when the odd year session years, the House would have, instead of now they had 30 days of session, they would now actually have up to 42. And on the long years, like this year of session, they have 60 days of session available to them. Well, now they would have 72. And, listeners of the show know I'm not a big fan of this. Call me, party pooper coop today, because I don't like a lot of what a lot of other Republicans seem to be doing. But, I talked about when Matt Lockett proposed his bill, that taking away that end day, you can see the legislature become essentially a full-time legislature, having a few days of session a week. Now you throw in Osborne's 12 days. So before I was like, hey, they could have a day of session a week-ish or so, a day and a half-ish. Well, you look at Osborne's throwing in this 12 on these long years where they can have 72 days of session. Take out the entire month of December because that's got a lot of stuff going on, and then take out a few other weeks here or there that they would want to have breaks. You'd be looking at them having enough days to have 2 days of session a week. With legislative work days and other meeting days, you would have no problem seeing the legislature now basically working 5 days a week and passing more legislation. Now, people who are for this will say a few things. First, they'll say that the legislature needs to be able to keep the governor in check. They need to be able to call themselves into session. And they're right. I do agree with that. I do think that the legislature should be able to call itself into session, and they should get, I would say, somewhere around 6 to 10 days a year to be able to call themselves into session after end date. So if they need to address an emergency situation or get together a piece of legislation to fix a problem going on, and the governor is refusing to do that, then that is something that I get on board with. I see the wisdom of that. Something crazy is happening, like, there's city council going crazy somewhere, or a crazy corrupt individual that needs to be impeached. Yeah, I could see the legislature needing to call itself into session. So I agree with that portion, but I don't agree with getting rid of the end day. Now, people who say that they're for it, they say they're for it because they want a legislature to be able to extend out to days. They could take more time and they could pass better legislation. But may I remind you, okay, we just got handed the state budget Okay. That is 20 billion more than the next budget has ever been. This massive budget, $20 billion more than our big budget that was 2 years ago, has us going up to $3.5 billion more in debt for sure, has the potential for us to be billions more in debt on top of that. And they tell us, the audacity tells us this is a very conservative budget. Let me tell you what's so important about this budget. It's so conservative. This best budget we've ever passed. I've heard it. Maybe you've heard it. And despite the fact that they've had 2 years to prepare this budget, they are still, these legislators got the budget 30 minutes before they were told they had to vote on it. So we know they have to make a budget every 2 years. This doesn't sneak up on anybody. We know that they were drafting a budget, but despite that, we still have legislators that have no idea what's in the budget. 1, 2, they're not told what's in the budget. 3, they're not handed the budget bill till 30 minutes before they vote for it. Do you really think taking away the end date of the session would change that behavior? I mean, they're doing it now. They have another, 2 months to pass that budget bill. And they're rushing it through now, this bill that they supposedly prepped for 2 years. So no, I don't think taking away the end day is going to make them pass careful, more thought out pieces of legislation. It's just, I don't see that happening. And also I don't see wisdom in creating a full-time legislature. Because remember, and this was the argument I made a few months ago, that until the legislature passes a law on something, you have the power. See, a lot of people think the power of government either lies with the governor or somebody in the executive branch or the legislature, and that's it. But the power over what you do with your life also relies with you, the people. For an example, if the legislature, and this is an example I used at the time, until somebody makes a law saying otherwise, you can burn brush on your property whenever you want to. It's your property, you can burn brush. Then when somebody comes along to pass a law, they're now taking the ability to burn brush away from you. And so how this applies is that if a legislature is essentially full-time, able to pass laws year-round, and something happens, like there's a brush fire in a county, and so a legislator decides, I need to do something. So they put forward a bill to ban burning of brush across the state because, if it saves one life or whatever, rather than just letting emotions settle several months later. Now it's not even a thing anybody thinks about, but now, somebody died from a brush fire. So if you don't ban burning brush, you just want people to die. That's all you want. And so you need to vote to ban burning a brush. And then they end up voting and they take away liberties and freedoms from the rest of us. And so when the legislature makes a law, they're not just taking power away from the governor. They're not just limiting what the governor can do. They're also taking power away and limiting what people like you and me can do. And personally, I don't think we need to be passing a bunch more laws. Like we have a lot of, now I understand to repeal laws, you had to pass laws. I get that. But at the same time, do we really need to be passing as many pieces of legislation as we're doing? And on top of that, we're not actually passing a lot. That's the other issue. Is they say, it's better, it'll help them plan better. They've had a full year to plan for this session. And as of right now, I think only one bill has passed out of both chambers. Both chambers have passed individually. Bills have had either chamber vote on them. Several bills have. But as far as pass both chambers, sent to the governor to sign, how many has that happened with? It's only been one so far. And so all that time to plan, and this is what they pulled out with. But we're told, if we just had more days to vote somehow, or we could spread it out, we'd pass better pieces of legislation. Not a big fan. Now, those of you may remember that this amendment failed in 2022. Now, Osborne is attempting to simplify the language a little bit more and take another stab at getting this passed. Will it happen? I don't know, because the part of the problem is people naturally don't like changing their constitution. That's important too. They shouldn't. But at the same time, it's complicated to understand how this works. And so people are just going to naturally vote no. Will this solve the problem? I don't personally think so. There's also not a huge lot of funding apparatuses to really pass to make this make it pass. So you may remember the legislature passing out of the House, and the Senate also has a bill on this to ban localities from forcing landlords to take Section 8 housing. Despite this, Lexington's marching forward with their ordinance, putting themselves between a rock and a hard place, while also we take a look at these Democrats playing another inside-outside game of, well, this bill's stupid, it's not needed, while at the same time claiming that it's tyrannical and going to take down ordinances. So this weird kind of, it's not happening, but if it is, it's great argument that we hear so often from Democrats now in our brave new world. We'll be having all that after this short break. You're listening to the Andrew Cooperrider Show. And you are back with the Andrew Cooperrider Show, your source for Kentucky politics. So you may remember a few weeks ago, I think last week, the legislature passed out of, I think, both chambers. I know the House passed it because we covered the floor debates on it. A bill to ban locales from mandating that landlords take Section 8. So you've seen this in Louisville. Lexington's considering an ordinance right now, parts of northern Kentucky, where there has been these ordinances that say that a landlord cannot decide to not rent to someone solely because they have Section 8. And obviously, this is a private properties concern. Now, we've dug into a little bit about what the requirements of Section 8 is before, but regardless, it is overreaching. And also, there is, like, it's a property rights. You own the home. You can choose to rent it out to who you want to rent it out to. And the problem with Section 8 isn't just all the government regulation and hoops and paperwork that landlords have to jump through, but also there is a belief of the type of tenant that they say, look, if Section 8 individuals are not paying their own rent themselves, while some may be taking care of properties amazingly. But when you're not paying for something and somebody else is, you're less likely to take careful care of something. And regardless if that's true or not, regardless if you think, oh, that's an unfair stereotype and blah, 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 it really doesn't matter. Because here's what matters, is they own the home. It is their decision what risk they want to take with that home. It is their property. They can choose to rent it to nobody if they want to. It is their property, and who are you to tell somebody else what they are to do with their property? And the same goes for you. You shouldn't be forced to do anything with your property as well. That's basic property rights. So because places like Lexington and Louisville are considering these things, we had the legislatures moving forward with this bill to ban those types of actions. Well, despite this, though, and even though Senator Reggie Thomas from Lexington recognizes that when this bill goes through, it will strike down the Lexington ordinance, Lexington still passed out a committee, and it will be considered by the full body, a ordinance to require landlords to take Section 8 housing, and now they're caught between quite the rock and a hard place here, and honestly, the taxpayers who's going to lose. Because it is going to be very difficult. So the city passes this ordinance. If they attempt to enforce it after this law passes, then they will get sued. And the taxpayers will have to be paying for the court fees. And I tell you what, the people suing them are probably going to win. Because not only is it a state law now, but also that state law of saying a person's property is a person's property, you can't claim it as unconstitutional. And no matter how much Democrats and liberals want to yell about it, there's no right to housing in the Constitution. You don't have a right to something you get from somebody else. It's impossible to have a right to that. Actually, the people who own those homes have more of a right to do whatever they want with their homes in the Constitution than you have a right to live in their home. Funny enough, that's how it works. That's what our Constitution was founded upon. So obviously, I think it's like a 99% chance that they'll end up losing this court case, but that won't stop the taxpayers from having to pay for it. And that's where everybody ends up getting messed over because they know they shouldn't be doing this. They should be waiting to see if the legislation passes. And then if it doesn't and they really want to do it, push it forward. But instead, they're going to push forward this tyrannical property rights destroying ordinance and then end up having the taxpayers having to fund the court cases involved in this, which is just ridiculous. It's how we end up costing tons of money. But what you also see here is this inside-outside game of nobody's doing this. No law requires this, but if they are, it's a good thing. So I turned to the Kentucky Lantern. So they wrote an article called GOP Bill would ban KY cities from requiring landlords to accept Section 8 vouchers. None do. So they write this article titled about how you don't need this law because, well, none of these cities are requiring landlords to take Section 8 vouchers in the first place. And I'm quoting from the article now. This is a Kentucky Lantern's a very liberal publication. But quoting from the article, affordable housing advocates in the state told Lantern that no local Sydney ordinance currently mandates that landlords accept tenants using low-income housing assistance to pay rent. That includes a Louisville ordinance that bans landlords from refusing to rent to someone based upon their source of income, including if a tenant is applying for a rental with housing voucher. Lexington is also considering a similar ban. Now, just on its face, that's clearly false. I mean, listen to that sentence again. Affordable housing advocates in the state told Lantern that no local Sydney ordinance currently mandates that landlords accept a tenant using low-income housing assistance to help pay the rent. Period. That includes a Louisville ordinance that bans landlords from refusing to rent someone based on their source of income. I mean, are we speaking the same language? Do words not mean what we think they mean anymore? I mean, within their own quote, within their own article, no local ordinance currently mandates that landlords accept a tenant using low-income housing assistance to help pay rent. That includes a Louisville ordinance that bans landlords from refusing to rent to someone based upon their source of income. They actually wrote this down and didn't think critically about it at all. I mean, literally, the article is titled, GOP bill would ban KY cities from requiring landlords to accept Section 8 vouchers, none do. But if the bill is banning that law, is banning that cities mandate that they accept Section 8 housing vouchers, well, then how is it going to end the laws that aren't supposedly banning it in Louisville and being considered in Lexington? This is like this odd inside-outside, like, this doesn't even make sense. Do they even hear themselves? That's why this bill is necessary, because it clearly does. No matter how much they lied to you about what these ordinances do, the fact that the bill bans them tells you that they do exactly what we don't want them to do, to force people with their private property, to force down on them who they rent to. That's what it's about. Now, a few people, not very many, but a few people did reach out to me, as I knew they would, about my hot take on cursive. Lindsay Tishner proposed a bill to mandate teaching of cursive in K through 12 schools, and that students be able to sign their name before they graduate, to which I said that cursive is outdated and we should just let it die. And of course, as expected, I got a fair amount of messages from people saying, Andrew, I write notes in cursive all the time. And there was one thing that these people all had in common. They were typically a little bit older. Okay. And that is my point. All right. My point is that I get it. You want the world to do cursive for whatever reason. You're just really attached to it. I hear you. But we're coming up, to use the phrase again, on a brave new world that doesn't need cursive. Okay. I've never, like I said, my generation and generations coming up, they don't use paper to take notes. And don't try to say, well, you won't always have a phone or somewhere else to write down notes. I was told that I'd never have a calculator when I was going to school as well. So, you look pretty dumb now, don't you? Because I always have a calculator. But my point is, even wrapping around to math, okay? Right now, as I sit, I do math in my head all the time. I use the math I learned in schools constantly. In fact, the fact that I took things like AP Prod and Stats, AP Calculus, AP Algebra, AP Physics, those types of high-level math classes have given me the ability to look at a lot of these statistics and data coming out of these phony studies and being able to dig down into the numbers. That's why I love numbers so much. So I use that information. And so I'm not trying to say get rid of that, right? We shouldn't get rid of math just because you have a calculator. But I literally, as I sit right now, remember more about the different types of rocks there are out there. Because at least when I walk around and I look at rocks, I think about it, Then I remember about writing in cursive. And the fact that I have forgotten how to write some parts in cursive tell you that it's never used. Because you know what? I've never walked into a doctor's office and had to fill out a form and it said, please write in cursive. You know what it says? It says, please write in print. Please print. I've never come across a document that says, please write in cursive. So it's not like I'm saying handwriting's out. Don't even teach people to write. No. Teach people to write. Teach them to print still. But cursive and becoming so attached to it, if it dies on its own, let it die on its own. It's okay. It's okay. People still be able to write. We could take that class time and teach them more about grammar, and that'll be fine. All right? It will. I promise. I promise it'll be fine. It's okay to recognize that we don't write as much with our hands anymore. We don't take quick notes. This generation doesn't with their hands as much anymore. And if our phones die, our computers die, and we can't make notes anymore the way that we have been, guess what? We can still print. And it may take a little bit longer to make the notes, but that's okay. Well, y'all, that's what we got time for today on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. Don't take me too serious on the cursive stuff. Have a great rest of your day.